He kept two ledgers, one for the money he made, and one for the men who thought they'd never have to pay him back. By the time Daegu figured out which ledger mattered more, it was already too late to matter to them. Daegu doesn't announce itself the way Seoul does. It hums instead of shouts, a city of barley tea and quiet transactions, where the loudest sound most nights is the clink of soju glasses and the occasional confession nobody meant to make out loud. O'Connell liked it that way. Cities that shout get watched. Cities that hum get underestimated. And underestimation, in his line of work, was worth more than gold. He was 14 the first time he understood the shape of real power. Not the kind that swaggers into a room, but the kind that sits quietly in the corner, sipping tea, already knowing everyone's secrets before they've finished lying about them. His uncle's pawnshop taught him that lesson for free. People pawned their wedding rings and confessed their affairs in the same breath, as if guilt were just another item you could hand across a counter and walk away lighter. Kang-il started writing it all down. Not because he planned to become a criminal mastermind. He just liked knowing things other people assumed were forgotten. By the time he was 28, that habit had metastasized into something the local crime families didn't have a polite word for. He wasn't muscle. He wasn't a boss in the traditional sense. No throne, no army, no dramatic office with a view of the city he supposedly ruled. He was something stranger, something more permanent. The man 3 separate syndicates quietly paid to know things before those things became problems. If power was electricity, Kang-il was the wiring nobody saw and everybody depended on. Tonight, though, the wiring was about to short-circuit. The handoff was supposed to be routine, the 100-and-somethingth transaction of its kind, information exchanged in a back booth of a barbecue restaurant that smelled like charcoal and quietly ruined reputations. Across the table sat Yang Hyun-woo, a wiry enforcer with the kind of stillness that made grown men reach for their water glasses just to have something to hold. Kang-il had done business with him a dozen times. Predictable. Professional, boring, in the specific way that made a man trustworthy in this line of work. Except tonight, Hyun-woo didn't reach for the folder Kang-il slid across the table. He produced one of his own instead. "Before we do this," Hyun-woo said, setting the folder down with theatrical patience, "I think you should see something." Inside was a single photocopied page. Kang-il's handwriting, cramped, familiar, unmistakably his own, stared back at him from a page that should have existed in exactly one place. A locked safe only he knew the combination to. For 14 years, Kang-il had built an empire on the simple, elegant principle that information only has power when it stays exactly where you put it. Somebody had just proven him catastrophically wrong. "Recognize the handwriting?" Hyun-woo asked, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it. The gentleness of a man delivering bad news he'd rehearsed enjoying. Kang-il didn't answer right away. He was doing the math, the way he always did. Not the panic kind of math, but the cold, patient arithmetic of a man who'd spent a career learning that the first person to react is always the first person to lose. Somewhere in his empire, someone had gotten close enough to copy his own handwriting without him noticing. That wasn't theft. That was intimacy, weaponized. And whoever had done it wasn't sitting across the table from him. Hyun-woo was just the messenger, smiling because he thought he was watching a king fall. He had no idea he was about to watch one recalculate. Kang-il didn't reach for the folder Hyun-woo had produced. Instead, he did what he always did when the ground shifted beneath him. He ordered more tea. Panic was for men who hadn't planned for contingencies. Kang-il had planned for this exact moment for 11 years, though he'd hoped, with the particular arrogance of men who are usually right, that he'd never actually need to use it. "You know," he said, finally, turning the photocopy over in his hands like a man appraising a counterfeit bill. "There's a very old trick in my line of work. You want to know if a man is lying to you. You feed him a detail that isn't true. If he repeats it back like fact, you've found your leak." Hyun-woo's easy smile faltered by exactly 1 degree. Not enough for most people to notice, but Kang-il had spent his whole life cataloging degrees. "This page," Kang-il continued, tapping the paper, "has a name on it. A shipping contact in Ulsan. Convenient detail, very believable. Except that contact doesn't exist. I invented him 3 weeks ago and wrote him into exactly 1 page of my notebook. A page I never let leave the building." He looked up. So the only interesting question left is, how did a fictional man in Ulsan end up in your folder tonight? The restaurant noise kept humming around them. Grills hissing, waitresses calling out orders, someone's laughter 3 booths over. But the table between Kang Il and Hyun Woo had gone very, very quiet. I bought it, Hyun Woo said finally, choosing honesty the way a man chooses the lesser of 2 expensive mistakes. 2 weeks ago, a woman reached out through a contact of mine, said she had access to your books. I figured, man like you, someone was bound to get close enough eventually. A woman, Kang Il repeated, tasting the word like it might be another life folded inside a truth. Didn't give a name. Careful. Professional. The kind of careful that tells you she's done this before. Kang Il sat with that for a long moment, running through the short list of people who had ever been within arm's reach of that particular page. It wasn't a long list. It had never needed to be. That was the whole design. Trust so narrow it couldn't leak, like a pipe with exactly one valve. Which meant whoever had turned that valve wasn't a stranger who'd gotten lucky. It was someone he'd built the pipe with. He thought of Song-mi Ray, 11 years at her desk in the back office, files stacked with a precision that had once made him trust her with everything. His ledgers, his schedule, the small, unglamorous architecture of an empire that ran on details nobody else cared enough to track. She refilled his tea before he asked. She remembered the names of his associates' children. She had never, not once in over a decade, given him a reason to check the lock on the door behind her desk. Which was, he realized now with the particular nausea of a man recognizing his own blind spot. Exactly the kind of person you'd want on your side if you were planning to rob someone blind, patient, invisible, and trusted enough that nobody ever thought to ask what she did after everyone else went home. Finish the deal, Kang Il told Hyun Woo, sliding his own folder across the table like nothing had happened, because in this business, nothing had, yet. Tonight's transaction stands. What happens after tonight is not your concern. Hyun Woo studied him for a moment, clearly disappointed that the fireworks he'd been promised weren't going to ignite at his table. You're taking this well. I'm taking this accurately, Kang Il said. There's a difference. Anger tells the whole room what you know. Accuracy tells no one anything until it's already over. He left the restaurant the way he'd arrived. Unhurried, unremarkable, a man who could have been anyone walking home after a quiet dinner. But his mind was already 3 steps ahead, sorting through 11 years of small kindnesses and quiet competence, looking for the exact moment loyalty had quietly, invisibly, become something else. Somewhere in that city humming with barley tea and secrets, Song-mi Ray was probably still at her desk, stacking files with the same careful hands that had apparently been photocopying his downfall in the margins. He wondered, walking home under streetlights that didn't ask questions, whether she'd been planning this for 11 years, or whether, somewhere along the way, he'd simply given her a reason he hadn't noticed handing over. Either way, the ledger was about to be reopened, and Kang Il had never once, in his entire career, left a ledger unbalanced. Kang Il didn't confront Mi Ray that night. He'd learned long ago that the first conversation after a betrayal is never really a conversation. It's a performance, and he refused to walk on stage without knowing his lines. Instead, he spent 3 days doing what he did best, disappearing in plain sight. He kept his usual schedule, drank his usual tea, nodded at his usual associates with the usual unreadable calm, all while quietly pulling every thread of his own operation apart and stitching it back together somewhere Mi Ray couldn't see. Accounts moved. Passwords changed. The real notebook, the one that mattered, the one with names that could end careers and marriages in the same sentence, relocated to a place even his own shadow didn't know about. On the 4th day, he asked her to stay late. Inventory, he said, which was technically not a lie. He was taking inventory, just not the kind she assumed. The office emptied out the way it always did, the accountants leaving in 2s and 3s, the low hum of Daegu's evening traffic filtering up through old windows. Mi Ray sat at her desk exactly where she always sat, files stacked in towers of obsessive precision, looking for all the world like a woman with nothing to hide except maybe a to-do list. You've been quiet the last few days, she said, not looking up. I've been thinking, Kang Il replied, settling into the chair across from her, a chair reserved, historically, for people who owed him money or apologies. About patience. about how the most dangerous people I've ever met were never the loud ones. They were the ones who waited 11 years before making a single move. Her pen stopped, just for a second, but a second was all he'd ever needed. I don't know what you mean, she said, and it was, he had to admit, a beautifully calm lie. The kind you only master after years of practicing something far more dangerous than bookkeeping. There's a man named Yang Hyun-woo, Kang Il said, watching her face the way other men watch stock tickers. Bought a page out of my notebook 2 weeks ago. A page with a name on it that doesn't exist, a name I invented specifically to catch whoever was reading over my shoulder. Only one person in this building has ever had unsupervised access to that safe. He let the silence stretch, patient as a tide. You always did have excellent handwriting, Mi-rae. Almost as good as forging mine. For the first time in 11 years, Song Mi-rae looked at him without the practiced softness she'd perfected, and underneath it was something colder, sharper, and far more interesting than betrayal alone. It was ambition, the same ambition that had built his own empire, just wearing someone else's face. Here's the thing worth sitting with for a moment, before we go further, because every empire has this moment, whether it's a Daegu back office or a boardroom in your own city. The people who betray you rarely start out as villains. They start out useful, trusted, invisible, right up until the day their patience runs out and yours becomes the price of it. If you've ever wondered whether loyalty is worth anything in a world built on leverage and quiet debts, drop your answer in the comments. And hit subscribe if you believe loyalty should be earned honestly, not stolen slowly over 11 years. Only the manipulators, the quiet betrayers, and the ones still writing their own version of Mi-rae's ledger won't. You built all of this, Mi-rae said finally, gesturing at the office, the files, the quiet architecture of his empire, on information other people didn't know you had. I just decided I wanted my own copy of the blueprint. And Hyun-woo. Insurance, she said, echoing, whether she realized it or not, the exact word Bo Sung had once used in a different city, in a different room, against a different man who'd also underestimated how far ambition could travel inside someone patient enough to hide it. In case you ever figured it out before I was ready. Kang Il almost laughed, the short, genuine kind of laugh that unsettled rooms far more than anger ever could. You weren't ready tonight either, he said. You just ran out of runway. He stood, buttoning his coat with the unhurried calm of a man who'd already won an argument nobody else in the room realized was over. I don't destroy the people who challenge me, Mi-rae. I've told you that before, back when you were still just my bookkeeper and not my competition. I simply make sure ambition points somewhere it can't hurt me again. She said nothing as he walked toward the door, though her eyes followed him with the sharp, calculating focus of a woman already drafting her next move, because she understood, better than almost anyone alive, that Kang Il's ledgers never, ever closed on the first entry. Behind him, the office lights buzzed faintly, indifferent to the quiet war that had just begun. Word spread faster in Daegu than anyone liked to admit, not through phone calls or careless mouths, but through the almost telepathic instinct criminals develop for smelling instability the way sailors smell a coming storm. Within a week, 3 of Kang Il's associates had quietly reached out, each one asking a version of the same question dressed up in different, more polite language. Is it true someone got inside your notebook? He answered each of them the same way. Someone tried. The notebook is fine. The person who tried is currently very busy regretting it. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't quite the truth either. And Kang Il had learned long ago that in this business, the space between those two things was where all the real work got done. Mi-rae hadn't run. That surprised him more than her betrayal had. Most people, once caught, either begged or bolted, the two responses of amateurs who'd never actually planned for the possibility of getting caught. Mi-rae did neither. She kept showing up to the office, kept stacking her files with the same obsessive precision, kept refilling his tea at exactly the moment he wanted it, as if the conversation in his office 3 nights ago had simply been filed away with everything else. It unnerved him more than he let on. A woman who wasn't scared of him yet was still choosing to sit 2 feet away from him every day was either supremely confident or had absolutely nothing left to lose. And Kang Il had learned that those 2 types of people were, in his line of work, equally dangerous. He decided to test which one she was. I need you to deliver something to Hyun-woo, he told her on Thursday, sliding a sealed envelope across her desk with the casual weight of a man asking someone to pick up dry cleaning. Personally, he doesn't trust couriers. It was, of course, a test disguised as an errand. The oldest trick in his own personal playbook, the one he'd used to build his entire empire from a pawnshop notebook. If she was working with Hyun-woo, this was an opportunity too good to resist. Unsupervised access to the very man she'd already sold information to. If she wasn't, it was simply an errand. Mi-rae took the envelope without hesitation, without so much as a flicker of the calculation Kang Il had spent 11 years learning to read on her face. Anything else? Just that, he said, and watched her walk out the door with the same unbothered calm she'd walked in with 11 years ago on her first day. He had someone follow her, obviously. A quiet, forgettable man named Choi, who specialized in being exactly the kind of person nobody remembered seeing. Choi called that evening with a report that told Kang Il everything and, infuriatingly, nothing at all. Mi-rae had delivered the envelope to Hyun-woo exactly as instructed, exchanged perhaps 4 sentences with him, and left without any of the lingering, comfortable body language of two people who trusted each other. Either she was innocent of collaboration with Hyun-woo specifically, or she was better at this than Kang Il had given her credit for, which was, given that he'd trained her without realizing it, entirely possible. That night, alone in his apartment with a pot of tea going cold beside him, Kang Il opened the real notebook, the one relocated 4 days earlier to a place even his own shadow couldn't find, and began writing something new. Not names this time, not debts owed or secrets collected. He wrote out, slowly and methodically, every possible version of what Mi-rae might actually want. Money didn't fit. She'd had ample opportunity to simply steal and disappear, and she hadn't. Revenge didn't fit either. He'd never wronged her, not once in 11 years. He was, if anything, unusually generous by the standards of his profession, and she knew it. Which left, uncomfortably, the possibility he liked least, that Mi-rae wasn't trying to destroy his empire at all. She was trying to inherit it. The thought sat with him longer than he expected, turning over in his mind the way a coin turns before it finally lands on one side. Because if that was true, then everything she'd done, the forged page, the careful leak, the calm, unbothered performance of a woman with nothing to hide, wasn't sabotage. It was an audition. And somewhere in Daegu's humming, in different streets, Song Mi-rae was very likely doing exactly what he would have done in her position, waiting for the perfect moment to show him precisely how good a student she'd become. The perfect moment arrived on a Tuesday, which struck Kang Il later as somehow appropriate. The most ordinary day of the week, chosen deliberately, he suspected, by a woman who understood that chaos wearing a boring disguise is the hardest kind to see coming. It started with a phone call from a man named Baek Young-ho, the head of the second largest syndicate in the city, a man Kang Il had done careful, profitable business with for 6 years without ever once raising his voice at him. "We need to talk," Young-ho said, in the flat, formal tone people use right before they stop being your friend. About the Ulsan shipment discrepancies. Kang Il's stomach did something it hadn't done in years. A small, cold drop, the physical sensation of a man realizing the ground he was standing on had quietly become a trapdoor. There were no Ulsan shipment discrepancies. There had never been a real Ulsan contact at all. The name existed in exactly one place. The decoy page he'd planted to catch a leak. The same page that had ended up, 2 weeks later, in Hyun-woo's folder at the barbecue restaurant. Which meant someone had taken his trap and built an entire fictional crisis on top of it. One convincing enough that Young-ho, a careful, skeptical man, believed it completely. "Give me an hour," Kang Il said, already moving toward his coat. He arrived at Young-ho's office to find something he hadn't anticipated, documents. Real ones, professionally forged, laying out a shipping discrepancy so detailed and specific that it took Kang Il nearly 10 minutes of careful reading to confirm what he already suspected. Every figure, every date, every fabricated detail traced back to the fictional Ulsan contact he'd invented himself, dressed up now in numbers convincing enough to threaten 6 years of trust with a man who didn't forgive mistakes twice. "Explain this," Young-ho said, sliding the folder across the desk with none of the warmth their years of business had earned. And here was the moment. The one Kong Il would replay later, turning it over the way he turned over coins, trying to decide whether he'd been outmaneuvered or simply outweighted. Because the easy explanation, the true explanation, was almost impossible to say out loud without sounding insane. I invented a fake contact to catch a spy, and the spy used my own lie to nearly destroy me. Nobody believes the truth when it sounds that convenient. So he didn't explain. He did something else instead, something that had taken him 20 years to learn and me, Ray, apparently, only 11 to steal. He told a better story than the one being used against him. Someone inside my organization has been selling fabricated intelligence, Kong Il said. Calm as still water hiding a riptide, specifically designed to make it look like I'm cheating my partners. It's clever. It's also traceable, if you give me 48 hours instead of an execution. Young-ho studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment, the kind of silence where 6 years of trust either holds or doesn't. 48 hours, he said finally. Then this becomes a different conversation. Kong Il left the building with the specific, focused calm of a man who understood exactly how close he'd just come to losing everything over a lie he'd invented to protect it. He found me, Ray, at her desk that evening, exactly where she always was, files stacked with the same maddening precision, as if the entire city hadn't nearly caught fire around her hands. "You almost got me killed," he said, without preamble, closing the office door behind him for the first time in 11 years. "I almost got you tested," Mireille corrected, finally setting down her pen and looking at him with none of the careful softness she'd worn for over a decade. "There's a difference, and you know it, because you've used that exact difference on other people more times than either of us can count." "Explain." "You built an empire on being the only person in every room who actually knew what was happening," she said. "I wanted to see what happens to that empire when someone else knows just as much and is patient enough to use it exactly the way you would." Kong Il felt something shift in his chest, not fear exactly, and not quite anger either. Something closer to recognition, the uncomfortable, specific feeling of looking into a mirror that had been quietly assembling itself in his own back office for 11 years. "You didn't want to destroy me," he said slowly, the pieces finally locking into place. "No," Mireille agreed. "I wanted you to see me. Really see me. Not the woman who refills your tea and files your ledgers. The one who could run this exactly as well as you. Maybe better, since I've spent 11 years watching you make it look effortless while catching every single mistake underneath." Outside, Daegu hummed on, indifferent and unhurried, while inside that small office, two of the most careful, patient people in the city finally stopped performing for each other and started, for the first time, actually talking. 48 hours was not a generous window when you were trying to prove a lie inside a lie without accidentally exposing the truth underneath both of them. Kong Il and Mireille spent the first 6 hours of it doing something neither of them had ever done together, working the same side of the table. "If I invented the contact," Kong Il said, spreading the forged shipping documents across Mireille's desk like a man laying out a crime scene, "then whoever built this case against me had to get the fabricated numbers from somewhere. Which means they didn't just read the decoy page. They elaborated on it. That takes time, patience, and access to shipping formats good enough to fool a man like Young-ho. That's not talent you find in a pawnshop notebook," Mireille said, tracing a finger along one of the falsified manifests. "That's someone who's worked logistics. Real logistics. Someone who knows what a legitimate shipping discrepancy actually looks like on paper." They both arrived at the name at nearly the same moment. The way two people solving the same puzzle from opposite ends sometimes meet exactly in the middle. "Young-ho's own logistics coordinator," Kong Il said slowly. "The one who first flagged the discrepancy to him. A man who'd benefit enormously," Mireille added, "if his boss suddenly stopped trusting his most reliable trading partner and started relying entirely on someone conveniently already inside the building." It was, Kong Il had to admit, an elegant piece of theater, cleaner, in some ways, than anything he'd built in 20 years. Someone had taken his own decoy, dressed it in convincing detail, and handed it to Young-ho not to destroy Kong Il directly, but to isolate him, to make Young-ho dependent on new information from a new source, conveniently positioned to become indispensable exactly the way Kong Il himself had once become indispensable to 3 separate crime families. The student, it turned out, wasn't the only one who'd been taking notes. We need proof, Kang Il said. Not theory. Young-ho doesn't deal in theory, and neither do I. What followed was the kind of work Kang Il hadn't done personally in years. Quiet, unglamorous, meticulous verification, cross-referencing shipping manifests against real port records, calling in favors from dock workers who owed him decades-old debts, staying awake past 3 a.m. with me Ray across the table from him, instead of 2 feet away pretending not to be a threat. Somewhere around hour 30, working through a stack of customs paperwork with the particular delirium that comes from too much tea and too little sleep, Kang Il found himself laughing. Actually laughing, the unguarded kind he hadn't allowed himself in years. What? Ray said, not looking up from her own stack. 11 years, he said. And this is the first time I've actually enjoyed doing this job instead of just being good at it. She looked up then, something unreadable passing behind her eyes before she buried it back under the same practiced calm she'd worn since the day he hired her. Don't get used to it. I still might replace you. You'd have to catch up first, he said. You're good, Ray. Genuinely. But you forged 1 page and got lucky with timing. I've been doing this since I was 14. And yet, she said, sliding a custom stamp across the table that proved, definitively, that the logistics coordinator's shipping numbers didn't match a single real manifest from the actual port. Here we are, solving your problem together, because apparently your genius has limits and my ambition has range. At hour 44, they had what they needed, a paper trail so thorough it left no room for theory, doubt, or plausible deniability. Proof that Young-ho's own coordinator had fabricated the Ulsan discrepancy from nothing, using Kang Il's own decoy as raw material for a much larger, much more personal betrayal. They walked into Young-ho's office together with 4 hours to spare, laying out the truth with the same patient, surgical precision Kang Il had used his entire career. Except this time, for the first time in 11 years, he wasn't the only person in the room who fully understood every detail of the case being made. Young-ho listened in silence, his expression shifting slowly from suspicion to something colder and more dangerous, directed now at a man who wasn't in the room to defend himself. 48 hours, Young-ho said finally, closing the folder with quiet finality. And you didn't just clear your name. You handed me a traitor I didn't know I had. Consider it a gift, Kang Il said, from someone who understands the difference between loyalty and convenience better than most people in this city. Beside him, Ray said nothing, but Kang Il felt it anyway. The small, specific shift of 2 people who'd spent a week trying to outmaneuver each other and had somehow, without either of them quite planning it, ended up standing on the exact same side of the table. Whatever came next, he understood now, wouldn't be a story about betrayal anymore. It was about to become a story about what 2 very dangerous, very patient people could build once they stopped testing each other and started, finally, trusting the results. Young-ho's coordinator disappeared from the city within the week. Not violently. Kang Il made sure of that, because he'd learned long ago that a man exiled and humiliated tells a far more useful cautionary tale than a man simply removed. Word traveled through Daegu's quiet, humming streets the way it always did. Not through announcements, but through the specific, satisfying silence that follows when everyone finally understands who not to underestimate again. 3 separate syndicates paid closer attention to Kang Il after that, not out of fear exactly, though fear had certainly not left the building. Out of something closer to respect, the grudging kind reserved for a man who'd been handed a trap built from his own cleverness and turned it, somehow, into the very thing that made his position stronger than it had been in years. But the real story, the one that mattered, wasn't playing out in boardrooms or barbecue restaurants. It was playing out in a small back office that smelled faintly of barley tea, where a man and a woman who'd spent a decade performing careful, polite distance from each other had finally run out of reasons to keep performing. You could have destroyed me, Kang Il said one evening, weeks after the dust had settled, watching Ray close out the last ledger of the quarter with the same obsessive precision she'd always had. You had the access. You had the patience. You clearly had the talent. I didn't want to destroy you, she said, not looking up. I told you that already. You wanted me to see you. I wanted to stop being invisible, she corrected. There's a difference. Invisible people get used. Seen people get to negotiate. Kang Il considered that for a long moment. Considered, too, the particular arithmetic of a man who'd spent his entire adult life collecting other people's secrets and had somehow, remarkably, missed the most important one sitting 2 feet from his desk for 11 straight years. So negotiate, he said finally. Mireille set down her pen and looked at him directly, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in over a decade of careful, professional distance. Equal partner, not bookkeeper, not assistant. My name goes into the real ledger, the one that actually matters, right next to yours. Everyone in this city learns exactly who they're dealing with when they deal with you. It should have been an easy no. Every instinct built over 20 years of hoarding leverage told Kang Il that shared power was diluted power, that the whole architecture of his empire depended on being the only person in every room who understood the full picture. But he thought of the 48 hours they'd spent solving a problem together instead of around each other, the unguarded laugh at 3 a.m. that had surprised him more than any betrayal ever could, the specific, rare relief of finally not being the only person carrying the weight of every secret in the building. Equal partner, he agreed. But you buy your own tea from now on. I'm done being your errand boy. For the first time since he'd hired her 11 years ago, Song Mi-rae actually laughed. Not the practiced softness she'd perfected for a decade, but something real, something that filled the small office in a way that made it feel, briefly, like an ordinary place where ordinary people worked. Word spread, as it always did in Daegu, quiet and inevitable as the tide. Within a month, nobody photocopied so much as a receipt near either of them again, because the city had learned, decisively, that trying to divide Kang Il from the woman who'd once tried to outmaneuver him was like trying to divide a ledger from its own math. The attempt had made them sharper, not weaker. It had turned a decade of careful distance into a partnership neither of them had planned for and both of them, it turned out, had quietly needed. Kang Il thought back, sometimes, to that night in the barbecue restaurant. Hyun-woo sliding a folder across the table, certain he was watching a king fall. He hadn't been wrong, exactly. The king who'd walked out of that restaurant 3 weeks earlier didn't exist anymore. In his place stood something the city hadn't seen before and didn't quite have a word for yet. 2 people who'd learned, the hard way, that the most dangerous empires aren't the ones built on secrets kept from everyone. They're the ones built on exactly one secret, kept between exactly 2 people who finally decided to stop keeping it from each other. The pawn shop where it had all started still stood, unchanged, on a quiet Daegu street corner, still smelling faintly of dust and confession. Kang Il walked past it sometimes, tea in hand, and thought about the 14-year-old boy who'd started writing down other people's secrets out of nothing more than curiosity. He wondered, occasionally, what that boy would have thought, watching the empire he'd eventually built not fall, but finally, after 11 quiet years, find someone worth trusting with the whole ledger.